Ludmilla stood alone on the cobblestones after the doors of the royal villa closed behind Moman. The violent lesson that had accompanied his words left an unforgettable impression, but she still pondered the rest of what was said. She recalled Nobbe's in human form and thought that this sorcerer king perhaps ruled over many beings like her, or those even more bizarre. With this in mind, she could not help but peer about the empty district, but it seemed to be just that, empty. Moman had informed her that she had a talent, true sight? And thinking back on the day's events, she supposed that it must be true. Beyond being able to see Nobbe's true appearance, however, she had no idea what exactly it did. Her entire life had been spent in the duchy's lands surrounded by other humans, so there was nothing really out of the ordinary to notice, not even during her previous visits to Iranthal. The world around her looked much the same as always. She had no recollection of anyone in her family having any sort of talent, and her studies were similarly lacking when it came to the many mysteries of the world that had no impact on her generally mundane life. She decided that there was no point in standing around agonizing over it. Uncertain about when she would be summoned to present herself before the royal court, Ludmilla started making her way towards a certain area within the guest houses that occupied half of the central district. Arranged in a rough circuit lining the innermost wall of the city, the luxurious buildings were meant to offer hospitality to visiting aristocrats and dignitaries, as well as to provide permanent residences for the duchy's nobles that preferred to conduct their affairs out of Iranthal. Ludmilla's family stayed in this part of the city during their usual winter visit. It was her lord father's single major expenditure for the year, used both as a window to show his children the standards that wealthier nobles enjoyed, and a way to provide them with the most exposure to the other members of nobility to make connections with others in their limited time away from the border. The latter part was something that none of her family ever seemed to succeed in. She easily oriented herself once she identified a few familiar landmarks. The street that encircled the entire district was normally quiet unless someone was hosting their guests outdoors, but the eerie atmosphere that hung in the air was decidedly unnatural. There were no servants going about their tasks, no sign of officials or dignitaries traveling to and fro on business. The lanes and buildings had been scoured clean, yards and gardens left perfectly groomed. The immaculate, polished appearance of her surroundings combined with the deathly silence gave everything a sterile feeling, much like that of a well-kept cemetery. After following the street over its circular route for several minutes, she reached the building that was her destination, a large, single-story structure that served as a sort of clubhouse for both the district's residents and its visitors. She thought that she would be able to find some of the staff servicing the district here and have them direct her to available accommodations. The stone path leading through the yard to the building was unattended, so she had to juggle her bags around in order to open the ornately fashioned entrance. The door whispered open on oiled hinges, and Ludmilla slipped in on one side. Thankfully, the inner entrance of the landing was propped open, so she did not need to awkwardly maneuver herself in between to open the second set of doors. She stepped forward over onto the lush, crimson carpet to the front desk, setting her bags on the floor as she waited for the reception staff. The motion in the foyer caused several of those inside to turn in her direction, which then prompted others to also face her way as well. Ludmilla scanned the people that occupied the lounge just inside the clubhouse. She recognized many as nobles or members of noble families that held titles in the duchy. As she looked over the group to identify each in turn, a familiar woman's voice spoke from behind her. "Ludmilla?" It was tentative at first, but when Ludmilla turned around to face the person who called her out to her, it overflowed with a relieved certainty. "Ludmilla, it is you." A young woman close to her own age had come from the hallway leading to the more private areas of the building. She stepped forward excitedly, initially holding up her long cobalt skirts to run to her, until she remembered herself partway and assumed a more dignified pace. "It has been a while, Clara." Ludmilla smiled politely and made a warm greeting in return. Seeing the familiar face fanned the embers of her own hopes. Clara was the daughter of Baron Corlin, her name styled in the manner of the Western nobility. House Corlin administered the only other port on the Katza River, which lay several hours down the rise from where Iranthal overlooked the surrounding lands. As trading partners, House Corlin maintained a close relationship with House Saradnik. Clara was betrothed to Ludmilla's eldest brother. She had a cheerful disposition which shone as brightly as the waves of her golden hair, and he had received the engagement happily. However, Ludmilla saw no sign of her brother amongst the other nobles in the lounge. Lord Zaradnik and your brothers, are they well? Clara took Ludmilla's hands in hers as she asked after her family. Ludmilla's smile froze at the question. Because of Clara's relationship to her brother, she was about to ask the very same thing, but Clara's question left her own hanging unspoken. Her close friend did not miss her reaction, and her warm hands grew as cold as Ludmilla's own. But after the chaos, Clara's voice shook. Your ship was gone from the harbor. We thought that surely this meant they had returned home. Ludmilla shook her head. The ship returned, she replied, but with only a handful of men. My lord father and my brothers were not amongst them. A part of why I came here was to see if I could find anyone. The exclusive location made it the natural place for nobles to gather in large groups, as was the case before her. She had hopes that even if her family wasn't here, there would at least be someone with information on their whereabouts, or knew their fate. Encountering a familiar face had immediately raised her hopes, but they were dashed as surely as Clara's crestfallen expression. The almond eyes that she always remembered sparkling with life welled with tears, and Ludmilla had to look away to avoid following suit. There were maids spaced out evenly in the room, presumably to attend to the needs of their guests, but none came forward to the aid of the young noblewoman who had begun quietly sobbing. If anything, they seemed blissfully unaware of their responsibilities. The others in the lounge stood about murmuring to one another while observing the exchange, sound carried quite clearly by design in the open spaces of the clubhouse. They were probably digesting the new information. With some consternation, Ludmilla searched for a place where she could take Clara that wouldn't disturb the other guests. A tired sigh turned her attention towards the lounge again as a figure rose from one of the chairs. Really, have you all forgotten how to conduct yourselves? A stern voice seemed to push aside the conversation from the younger nobles around her. She was a severe-looking woman with steel-grey hair that hung over her shoulder in a large braid, dressed in a conservative russet gown with little in the way of highlights or flourishes. Radiating the air of a noble matron who brooked little nonsense, Ludmilla recognized her as Dowager Countess Villet. Her deceased husband's title had passed on to her son who had long since married, but she was still active and influential amongst the ladies of the ducal court. As she made her way towards the pair in the foyer from the lounge, she continued in a reprimand that seemed to be addressing everyone within earshot. With everything that's happened, she said, the last thing we need is you lot continuing to mope around like a bunch of invalids. Just how long must this go on for? While she spoke, the sharp clicking of heels from a different hallway could be heard that drew everyone's attention away from her. Another maid had emerged from the corridor that Clara had appeared from. She was quite tall, a bit taller than Ludmilla, with a measured stride exuding confidence and grace. Pale, almost translucent skin emphasized a picturesque beauty that made her wonder if this woman was not actually some impossibly fine statue carved from the purest marble. The generous curves of her figure amply filled out the lines of her outfit, but unlike many young women who would surely flaunt such an advantage, she held a strictly formal posture while her immaculate uniform retained its crisp and conservative appearance. Light from the entryway gave a rich sheen to her jet black hair, which was made up into a tall bun. The glow of the evening glimmered off of the black frames of her spectacles as she stepped forward. As the nobles in the room stood entranced by the beautiful maid, she walked up to the pair at the front desk and lightly placed her hand around Clara's shoulder. Baroness Corlin, you must stay strong, the maid gently admonished the sniffling noblewoman. Come, let's find you a place to rest. She slowly led Clara away from the gaze of the onlookers in the lounge, speaking in soothing tones. Ludmilla suddenly realized that Clara had also been addressed by her father's title. Her father and brothers must have gone missing as well. Up until that point, Ludmilla thought the maid bore some sort of similarity to the guise of Nobe of Darkness, but her care for the distraught Lady Corlin gave her a much warmer impression, much like what Ludmilla imagined an older sister might feel. She was so captivating that even the previously unresponsive maids that were supposed to be attending the room were paying close attention to her. Humph, a grunt from the side caused Ludmilla to start. At least someone has their head on straight. Villet spoke as the maid slowly led Baroness Corlin out of the building. She had walked the rest of the way from the lounge area while the scene between Clara and the maid had drawn everyone else's attention. Ludmilla suspected that the old noblewoman had purposely moved close before speaking to startle her. I always thought that you were one of the more grounded kids in the batch, the aged woman told her, but it seems like you're just about as helpless as the rest. Though Ludmilla did not particularly enjoy being the target of the Dowager Countess' criticisms, she felt slightly relieved that the old woman seemed none the worse for wear. The irritable matron was actually a driving force amongst the noble women of the duchy, often haranguing even married ladies over their behavior and actions, or lack thereof. Given the situation that they had now all found themselves in, having Villet around was a greatly reassuring thing. "And what about you, Villet went on. "How long are you going to stand in the doorway like some sort of lost page?" Her voice shot over Ludmilla's shoulder, stabbing into its unsuspecting target. Ludmilla turned at the sound of a boy gasping as the words found their mark. He was perhaps 12 years of age, no, maybe not even that. Dressed in the finery of a noble that hung loosely in several places, it seemed that he still had yet to fully grow into his clothing. By his general appearance and lack of visible attendants, he had neither the care nor attention of any servants. What looked to be a failed attempt at taming his sandy hair topped off the unkempt, rascally image. In a more normal situation, his insecure appearance and nervous manner might have tickled some urge to tease or protect him by a gaggle of older girls, but for the time being Ludmilla snatched his arm and led him to the lounge where the other nobles awaited before the ornery old lady could lash out at him again. Several long couches, as well as an assortment of plush chairs, were loosely organized in a circle around the center of the open space. A huge, midnight blue rug lay over most of the floor, cushioning the steps of those who traversed the room. Standing in groups between 3 or 4 people, the nobles in attendance had divided themselves up in a conspicuous manner that Ludmilla could not quite put her finger on. Before she could ponder the arrangement for long, Villet had made her way to the center of the room, clapping her hands to gain everyone's attention. "This is as many as we're bound to get, I suppose," she began after enough heads had turned to face her. "It is high time we get our affairs in order." With Villet's words, the casual atmosphere of the room turned weighty. There was a loose rustling over the air as chatter dispersed and the various nobles around the lounge settled into their seats, readying themselves for the business at hand. When the motion around the room ceased and all heads turned towards her, she continued. "I trust that, by now, everyone is familiar with the terms of Erantl's annexation?" As her gaze slowly swept over the nobles in attendance, she was met with many nods and other affirmative gestures. Ludmilla had not seen these terms, but remained silent as she did not wish to interrupt the proceedings. Perhaps the following discussion would clue her in on what they were. "I share in the opinion that they are generous indeed," Villet said as she finished looking over the assembly. "His Majesty has decided that the laws of Reistice are to be retained. This includes the crown laws, as well as the ducal laws set forth by Lord Rothenmeier on behalf of our former liege where they are applicable. As such, we have also retained our titles, rights and obligations as nobles of this realm. The laws of Reistice protect nobles from unjust actions by other parties, including His Majesty himself, and so too are we similarly protected by these laws that have been adopted by the Sorcerer's Kingdom." Ludmilla nodded to herself, quietly absorbing the content of the noble matron's address. That the legal framework of Reistice had been kept intact was in line with what Momon suggested when they had first met. It meant that rather than uproot what had been established in favor of his own methods, the Sorcerer King saw fit to build upon the existing legal and administrative systems. His Majesty's representative, Lady Albedo, has also maintained that the appointment of executive officers remains the sole right of the Crown. The legislative branches of the government shall similarly remain unchanged. The royal, regional and local courts will function in a manner similar to how we've conducted our affairs in the past. If the few remaining nobles standing in the clubhouse lounge represented all that remained of the aristocracy, Ludmilla felt that the old arrangement would be somewhat superfluous. The upper and lower courts of Reistice were attended by a noble's vassals, as well as any foreign petitioners, and at each level functioned in a similar manner. The royal court was attended to by the king's vassals, who represented the interests of their own courts. The courts of the king's vassals, in turn, would be attended to by their own vassals, who held their own courts. In this way, only the issues which impacted the realm as a whole, such as war and large-scale disasters, would filter up to the royal court. Disputes between farmers, matters of maintenance and local justice would not make it past the nobles who ruled directly over the land, or their appointed proxies. Since Erantl was a duchy belonging to King Ramposa III, and was appointed a royal provost in the form of Lord Rothenmeier, the king had been their representative in the royal court of Reistice. Now, however, The regional court of Eranthal was the royal court. Ludmilla wondered if that meant that they simply planned to just keep the royal court as a council of appointed advisors and ministers. Either that, or the sorcerer's kingdom had further planned for expansion and the creation of new titles. More relevant to recent events, Villet voice carried on, as the sorcerer's kingdom has a powerful standing military, the need for levies should be next to non-existent. As with everything else, the laws surrounding them have remained unchanged. I believe this to have been left in place for only the most dire of emergencies. The highest court of justice will remain as it is, reporting to the Crown. Details on how local laws are enacted and justice is enforced remains under deliberation for the time being. If nothing changes, it should remain the jurisdiction of the local administration. At the last, voices from around the room began to murmur. After many consecutive years of having their manpower tied up for months due to the annual confrontation with the Empire, it was a welcome piece of news that they would no longer be expected to raise armies to fight for the king short of an emergency. The statement on local authority raised all sorts of questions, however. Does that mean we can no longer create laws that address the issues unique to our fiefs? A noblewoman's voice arose from Ludmilla's left. If we are still allowed to do so, but lose our right to enforce those laws, are we to depend on His Majesty to act on our behalf? The low murmur rose as the nobles around the room discussed the points presented. It was indeed something to consider. Different fiefs had different industries and regulations associated with those industries, so it was concerning that the disparate territories might not be able to create local laws to address their specific needs. It would also be extremely odd for a minor noble to wait for the sovereign to enforce laws in their own small territories when it could just as easily be accomplished with the retainers or militia on hand. Villet cleared her throat, and the lounge settled down once again. I believe that these details are a matter to be brought up in the future once the regular proceedings of the courts have resumed. In similar vein to our concerns over local laws, the Guardian Overseer has also expressed that amendments to the Crown laws are not beyond consideration, and that new laws will be created to meet the country's needs as the nature of our sorceress kingdom is unlike that of the human society which we have been raised in. Once again, I must remind you that these terms are already beyond our best expectations, and that we should count ourselves fortunate. If this duchy had been annexed by the Empire, they would have torn apart whatever did not suit them to establish their own order, regardless of pre-existing laws and vassal arrangements. Do not mistake this generosity for tolerance, however. The fate of Count Facet should be proof enough that the royal court will not suffer fools. As the aged noblewoman continued to speak, Ludmilla felt increasingly out of touch. What happened to Count Facet? What in the world was a Guardian Overseer? It seemed to be some sort of official position within the royal court, an unfamiliar title that begged description. Count Facet ruled over the lands on the western border of the duchy, straddling the main highway leading to the rest of the kingdom. This made him one of the most prominent nobles in the territory, and he took advantage of his station in many ways. Her father had mentioned that he was a fairly aggressive man that leveraged the incomes and advantageous position of his territory to influence local politics, but the royal provost, Lord Mayor Panasoli Gruz de Retenmuir, had always kept his political aggression well in hand. At the thought of the rotund man, she recalled that he and the administrative staff of the city had fled. Even if the nobles could get their territories up and running again, how was the central administration to function without clerks and accountants? Finding educated people that were qualified for these positions was not something that could be done in a matter of weeks. Unfortunately, Villet was not so accommodating to her ignorance as to answer her unspoken question, moving directly on to her next order of business. In the meantime, Count Jesn told them, I believe that we should answer the Sorcerer King's trust in our capabilities by restoring productivity to the territories. Though, I suppose our first order of business should be to sort out the damage done to our houses and reorder the ranks. She looked around and let out a derisive noise. The lot of you look like some peasants at market about to start fighting over the day's scraps. Nothing will get done until you fix this. Ludmilla, already feeling a bit lost as the noble matron jumped between topics already familiar to the rest, stared blankly until the last piece fell into place with the aged woman's barb. She looked around the lobby again and finally understood why she initially thought the arrangement of attendees seemed off. The few noblemen in attendance were mostly too young. Everyone else was either a daughter of a landed noble or the wife or mother of one. Her mind went back to Milivich's testimony. Though she had acted on the news and evacuated her people, Ludmilla held on to the hope that she would eventually find her own family in the city. In hindsight, she should have known that the horrific events detailed in the account of the traumatized villager would have exacted a toll on everyone that had been at Katza. Villet Jesn was no longer simply the Dowager Countess Jesn. Her entire family had probably perished and the title had fallen back to her. Countess Jesn would now need to find some distant relation or adopt a suitable successor, as she was well past childbearing age. Ludmilla looked at each of the attendees, faces, names, houses, reconstructing the web of the new political reality of the realm. Most of the women present she had seen before on previous visits to the capital, either through interactions between houses or at the various social events and venues that had served as a pleasant backdrop to the dealings of the ladies of the nobility. The young girls and women now in attendance were the eldest unmarried daughters of each house. The older women were the wives or mothers of noble houses with no qualified successors. As for Countess Jesn's scornful remark about fighting for scraps, there was a tremendous problem. The number of eligible consorts in the realm had become disproportionately small compared to the single, childless noble women that had suddenly inherited all at once. She now understood the nature of the strange groups of nobles arranged about the lobby. Each had one or two boys in it, pressed in on all sides by women who were now in competition over a scarce resource. She looked to the lordling that she had brought in with her from the front desk. He was still timidly hovering around her. Several ladies nearby were sizing him up like a tender morsel, but none would dare directly challenge a frontier noble. Looking around, she saw that a countess had even gone so far as to claim the twin sons of one of her own baronies. It's not like I marked this kid for myself or anything. He wasn't too far off from her own age, actually. She stole a glance at the boy again. He was probably 3 or 4 years younger. The sigil of one of the inner houses was embroidered onto his oversized coat. The inner nobles were the members of the aristocracy that held titles close enough to Irantal to base their primary residence in the city or close to it. They tended to have the most developed fiefs and owned most of the industries around the city, as well as have the greatest access to trade and various connections. The boy put on something of a hunted look, as if he had suddenly realized his current place of refuge might have not been as safe as he had initially thought. Ludmilla was too busy calculating to notice, though, idly tapping her chin with her index finger. Baroness Saradnik. The cogs in her mind froze at the sound of a familiar voice behind her. She turned to see the tall, beautiful maid that had led the weeping Baroness call into a room waiting a respectful distance away. Yes? Ludmilla. Your presence is required in the council chamber, the maid told her, by order of the royal court. The summons have come sooner than expected, but in an entirely unexpected fashion. Using a maid to deliver a royal summons was entirely unheard of by any nation in the region. Ludmilla glanced out of the corners of her eyes to gauge the reactions of the other nobles, but they only stood by quietly, watching her in turn. Ludmilla had not yet moved into a residence, nor had she changed from her traveling clothes. However, she could not delay the audience. If this maid was delivering the will of the royal court, then she also represented the authority of the Sorcerer King. This being the case, there was only one answer. Quickly arranging her common appearance as best as she could, she lowered herself in a deep curtsy before the maid. I am at His Majesty's service. The maid smiled gently and turned to walk towards the exit of the clubhouse. Ludmilla followed her out of the clubhouse, taking one last look back at the lounge. 3 other noble women had already converged on the boy that she had left to their predations, and the gathering of nobles had gone on to discuss other matters. With the summons taking precedence over the nobles' session, she hoped that she wouldn't fall even further behind. The measured tread of metal sabatons echoed through the empty halls of Rantal's royal villa. Remaining equipped in Moman's armor, Pandora's actor strode past the displays of exquisite art and luxurious furniture without even so much as a disinterested glance. He had already come down these halls on multiple occasions, and there was nothing new or interesting of note in the first place. The magical lighting lining the walls had been kept purposely dim and reflected weakly off of his dark armor and the polished marble floors. After catching up with Nabril, his mind became preoccupied with other things as he made his way through the corridors. None of their details went much beyond a simple registration of his surroundings. Albedo, the guardian overseer, insisted on convening at least twice a week. Out on the field, he and Nabril needed to regularly interrupt their journey and return to Rantal via teleportation magic to attend. The meetings had originally been twice per day, until several of the other NPCs had appealed for changes. The frequent interruptions interfered with their personal duties and assigned tasks. In truth, Albedo's obsessive perfectionism when it came to administrative matters would have probably had them constantly conferring with one another if she could somehow make it possible. Though Pandora's actor was well aware of her nature, he could still hardly fault her. Before the advent of their master's new realm, information regarding the state of the lands surrounding Nazarick had been treated as little more than a tiny part of the threat assessment taken of the regions nearby when they had initially arrived. However, now that Nazarick had come into its ownership, its denizens, Albedo and himself in particular, felt compelled to learn more of its history and peoples to discover the means to most effectively influence and govern them. The Guardian Overseer had taken to the task of overseeing the administration of the newly acquired territory as a natural extension of her role in the Great Tomb of Nazarick. Unlike Nazarick, however, this world was an alien place and Albedo lacked the tools and resources that she needed to perform what she considered her duties. She had neither the information to run a sorceress kingdom to her exacting standards, nor the means to collect that information at a level of detail which would satisfy her. There were no automated systems or status screens that would quickly deliver accurate and comprehensive data to one's fingertips, so, with the expectations of their master on her shoulders, she could hardly be held accountable for not being able to act with much confidence. It wouldn't be a stretch to say that, in his immediate role as Moman, he was also in the best position to acquire a feel for the territory and assist her. Unfortunately, to their vexed frustration, they had worked tirelessly to achieve only a simple, incomplete picture regarding the state of the realm since its annexation. The cooperation of the remaining nobles in the territory had been their best hope for a smooth transition, but the aristocracy was still reeling from the results of Katza Plains. As their own lands were being directly contested, every fief had answered fully when King Rumposa III called his banners. By the end of the massacre, every fief had suffered catastrophic losses. Those that survived had fled or otherwise disappeared, leaving a confused group of aristocrats that had no previous expectations of inheritance and thus no thorough preparations to assume the management of their titles. While many were still the recipients of a noble's education, it was simply no substitute for long years of being groomed for the role. Unlike Baroness Saradnik, whom they had just returned with, it would be fair to say that none of the other nobles were in any condition to manage their lands. The past week was simply insufficient for them to come to terms with their new reality. It was as if the girl had been cut from an entirely different cloth and, going by her account of history, this was actually the case. The resilient nature of her frontier heritage and strong bloodline had allowed her to land on her feet, so to speak, or at least maintain function to a workable degree. As he mused over the unexpected gem that they had discovered, the two doppelgangers reached the doors to the audience chamber. Though nearly 5 meters high, the thick ironwood offered little resistance as he made his entrance. He crossed the threshold, walked through the short antechamber and into the main space, where a feminine voice greeted him from the shadows beyond. "Thank you for your hard work, Moman." Seated behind the desk at the head of the room was the Guardian Overseer. Despite working without rest for weeks, she maintained her pristine smile and spotless appearance. The diaphanous dress of pure white that was her main article of clothing remained spotless and unwrinkled, her black hair and feathered wings well groomed. The demon's amber eyes followed them as they made their way into the chamber. If she had any feelings of stress or fatigue, not a hint of it could be sensed out of the austere image that she projected. The large audience hall had been converted into a council chamber shortly after their acquisition of Irantal. Albedo's desk was placed to the right of the throne on its raised dais. They were still debating over what would be an appropriate replacement for the shabby wooden one that the previous ruler used. 2 rows of tables, lined with short benches facing inwards, had been placed on low platforms along the walls. The arrangement gave all who attended a clear view of the large rectangular table that occupied the center of the room. Tall windows occupied one wall from floor to ceiling, but thick drapes had been drawn tightly over them, completely preventing any light from creeping inside. As with the halls on the way through the royal villa, the magical lighting here was kept purposely dim, save for a spotlight that spilled over the center of the chamber. It appeared that several of the others were already present. Sabos was seated at the table to Albedo's right. Seated across the chamber from Sabos were Cocytus and Chiltia, with Entoma behind them. Nabril had taken to the wall behind Sabos, and she had already donned her uniform as a member of the Pleiades. Pandora's actor elected to stay in Momon's armor and moved to tastefully complete the balance in the room, taking a seat on the bench beside Sabot's own. Demiurge was attending to his projects far to the southwest in the Abelian Hills and only appeared at their meetings occasionally. This also meant that Aura and Mare would be watching over Nazarick while the other guardians were present here. Their master, Iron Zulgown, had withdrawn from the public eye, shutting himself away for some purpose beyond their understanding. After Pandora's actors settled into his seat, Albedo broke the silence. Report. The city and its people remain at peace. No unexpected developments. At the lake. Absolutely nothing new, Tilda. A vein popped up on Albedo's temple as the last response was punctuated by a bored yawn. Her slitted, glowing eyes stabbed in the direction of Pandora's actor. The annoyance at the lack of anything useful from the others was clearly evident. Folding his gauntleted hands over the table, he leaned back on his seat and looked at each of the assembled members in turn before settling on his presentation. We completed our sweep of the southwestern region of the duchy. His bold voice filled the chamber. Development of the lands has deteriorated as much as the preliminary reports by Aura suggested. Little remains of the human expansion indicated by the records we discovered left in the city. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that the lands have become mostly feral beyond the main arteries of trade. Though it's regrettable that we're unable to take advantage of past developments, this also means we'll have a free hand in reshaping the region to suit our master's purposes. Keeping his report simple, he laid out a cue for Albedo's usual lament, one that she had expressed in one form or another recently. And how do you propose we do this? Her fuming was barely contained. There are barely enough farmers to help direct the cultivation of the lands nearest to the city, if we can even get them to stop cowering and start working. These nobles are similarly useless. I had some tiny expectation of their being able to handle at least minor administrative tasks, but they're all still preoccupied with wailing into each other's skirts. Albedo was furious when they first discovered just how perilous the condition of Erantle had become after the occupation of the duchy. While the losses from the Battle of Katza Plains were factored in, the state of its inhabitants was beyond their expectations. Before the territory was formally handed over half the population had fled, nearly all of this number from the rural areas. Every one of the surviving nobles that was present to witness the one-sided massacre had uprooted themselves as well, leaving a hodgepodge of widows and orphans to inherit the shambles of the aftermath. Most of the citizens of the urban areas had nowhere to go, so they remained to fearfully await their fate. With Momon being dispatched to the rural territories to keep everything from falling apart entirely, the city folk lost their sense of safety and hid themselves away in their homes, only briefly appearing once in a while to secure provisions. Though their fears were unfounded, that there was no grim fate that awaited them at the hands of some sort of undead abomination, it did not remedy the fact that nothing was happening. Erantle served as the duchy capital and a major hub of inland trade, but with no active rural populations to service and commerce suddenly non-existent, the city's economy was effectively frozen. Pandora's actor had initially played this tug-of-war between keeping the people of the city confident enough to leave their homes and going out into the territories to do the same, but, in the end, decided that the city would have to wait since it could not serve its primary function anyways until the territories were returned to normal. Albedo had originally expressed a great amount of anticipation. The prospect of having new lands to administer was a means to advertise her quality to their master, but it quickly turned into helpless frustration when it was apparent that the duchy had effectively broken down. Still, though, she had figuratively rolled up her sleeves and dug in for the long battle to get things up and running again. This was certainly admirable, but the fact of the matter was that she could not do everything herself. On that note, we did find someone of value while we were out there. Pandora's actor slid smoothly into the wake of her exasperation. There was still one frontier holding that was still populated. Frowning at the realization that she had been used as a segue, Albedo snatched a large sheet of paper out from between the piles of books and documents on her desk. It was the same map of the duchy that he and Nabril both had, with amendments made to it as new information from their travels became available. "Which territory?" she said as she placed the map before her. "Zaradnik," he replied. "Guardian of the upper reaches of the Katza River, on the southwestern border with the wilderness." Albedo's eyes flashed towards him as though in reprimand for his applying the term guardian to such a lowly creature. However, Warden's Vale was the gateway between the Duchy of Randall and the vast wilderness beyond, so the purpose of this noble house was clearly to be the first line of defense against invaders. As her eyes scanned the map and applied the new information to the overall portrait in her mind, he knew that the strategic value of this location would further reinforce the notion of a role that they were all well acquainted with. "So you believe that this barren will be useful?" she asked. "Baroness, actually. Another orphaned girl, you mean?" Albedo rolled her eyes as she cut him short. "We have more than enough of those useless sops weeping their days away in the city already." On the contrary, Pandora's actor raised a hand to stay her disdain. "She appears to have several years of experience administering her own fief already. If I may say so myself, she is far more competent than her age would suggest, though her worldview appears to be mostly limited to matters pertaining to her immediate duties. In addition, she comes from a strong adventurer bloodline and possesses one of the so-called talents that these natives have. Her value is far greater than the average citizen here." "I've had my fill of those so-called talents," Albedo sneered. "You were present yourself the last time they were demonstrated, I believe. It had better not be something utterly pointless like that vermin with the ability to divine one's undergarments." Their master was present at the demonstration as well, and Albedo had been mortified. Pandora's actor wondered if the man with the legendary talent was still alive. "I suppose that, in a way, they are somewhat similar," he mused. There was a sharp expulsion of frozen air from Cocytus, who was sitting across from him, and a snick sound as the pen Albedo had been using to take notes snapped in half. "The girl has what appears to be true sight," Pandora's actor said lightly. The already quiet room grew quieter still. The air seemed to grow ever colder, and Albedo loomed malevolent over her desk, as if she could use her glare to pin Pandora's actor to his seat. True sight was an ability that existed in Yggdrasil as well. While he was not absolutely certain that the girl's talent was exactly the same, what he had seen of it seemed close enough as to not matter. True sight granted its wielder a powerful visual perception that foiled any and all forms of mystical and supernatural deception arrayed before it. This meant that anything from simple magical illusions to high-tier spells like Perfect Unknowable were powerless against her ability. Attacks that attempted to fool the target into believing that they were being injured, drowned or subjected to various debilitating effects would similarly be rendered useless if what was projected onto them did not match the reality that they saw. The true form of shapeshifters such as doppelgangers, as well as all other similarly disguised heteromorphs, were instantly laid bare. The effects of this sense were emulated by the mid-tier spell True Seeing and was part of the repertoire of many of Nazaric's casters. Its utility for the role played by its wielder is abundantly clear. As a spell, it could be countered or nullified by magical effects that protected against divination, such as Nobrel's Ring of Non-Detection, but if it was simply a part of one's natural perception, there was no passive supernatural countermeasure against an ability that effortlessly defeated such countermeasures. Indeed, every floor of Nazarick had at least a handful of patrols that combined true sight with high natural perception to defeat attempts by invaders to sneak by undetected through a combination of various means. Baroness Saradnik was much like one of these sentries, though nowhere near as powerful in combat. She could call to attention anything magically concealed or supernaturally altered and potentially create an endless amount of problems. Pandora's actor, you. Of course I was wearing Momon's full plate armor, so she doesn't know, he chuckled. It's quite humbling to realize that Summer took my then-future role into consideration from the outset of this persona. The tension in the room lessened visibly. Baroness Saradnik saw Nobrel, though, he added nonchalantly. All of the heads in the room immediately snapped around to face Nobrel. Ever since the young noblewoman had been brought up as a topic of discussion, the battle maid had been trying to inconspicuously blend into the shadowed wall. She glanced back and forth nervously, unsure how to respond. Albedo spoke first, however. I find it difficult to believe that you of all people do not understand the ramifications of this. Indeed, he nodded gravely. It is because of who I am that I understand perhaps better than anyone else. The cavalier tone of Pandora's actor became deadly serious as he parried the Guardian Overseer's accusatory statement. The uncharacteristic shift caused all eyes in the room to once again be riveted onto him. While he had had some interactions with the other members of Nazarick, Pandora's actor was by and large only known as the mysterious NPC that defended and managed the guild treasury. While they also knew that he possessed the same degree of intellect as Demiurge and Albedo, most did not treat him as seriously due to his relatively carefree and quirky attitude. He was an existence that was merely a fact and not much else. As he emerged from the shadows and received more responsibilities, however, he had come to understand one more thing, that his being the creation of Momonga, Ainzul Gaon, subtly influenced the way the others weighed and measured his words and actions. Upon broaching the subject of Baroness Saradnik, the die was cast and he now brought his considerable abilities to bear. For the first time, the other NPCs understood what it meant when Pandora's actor took the stage. With a single sentence hanging in the air, the shadow of his presence emanated intangible tendrils into the silence that latched onto the hearts and minds of his audience and refused to let go. Their postures straightened, tongues stilled. They were pressed into the backs of their chairs by his sheer force of personality and simply watched and waited, holding their breaths, awaiting the next line of his performance.